All right, so Berkeley thinks he's fixed Locke's substance problem by taking Occam's razor and just cutting out the assumption that reality includes physical stuff that we experience through sense data. And he's saying, get rid of that. We know we experience sense data, but we don't know where it comes from. Let's just go with what we know. What we know is we experience sense data, and that we experience sense data as perceptions. And so to the extent that anything exists in reality, it exists as a perception. To be is to be perceived. To exist is to be perceived. All right, fair enough. So maybe Berkeley has fixed Locke's substance problem. But the implication of Berkeley's fix is that reality would be very different than how you and I experience it, right? We experience reality as pretty stable. But if Berkeley's right, that the only things that exist in reality are things that are perceived, then what happens when something's not being perceived by anybody? When we leave the room and there's no longer anybody perceiving the objects in the room, do the objects cease to be because they're not being perceived? If to be is to be perceived, then to not be perceived would imply that something no longer exists. But I've got utensils in my drawer upstairs that I'm assuming are still going to be there for me to have perceptions of, even though they're not being perceived right now. I would imagine you've got stuff in your home that is not being perceived by anybody, but you're probably pretty confident that it exists. It's not like things just pop in and out of existence constantly. So how does this work, that reality can be stable even when things aren't being perceived? Can you think of how Berkeley answers this question? Did you say God? Yes, of course. God is the eternal perceiver. Remember, for Berkeley, this omniscient, in other words, all-knowing, omnipresent, everywhere at all times being would be perceiving all things at all times. That's the nature of a being that would be all-knowing, right? So you can see here in this cartoon, we have some angels that say, Lord, we angels come to thee with a petition. And God says, shh, don't bother me now. I'm busy observing this tree. So God's the eternal perceiver. God is what creates this stability in reality. God is why things don't disappear when they're not being observed by or perceived by human beings or dogs or squirrels. God is this eternal perceiver. But this raises a question. Can you think of what it is? Okay, so if to be is to be perceived, can God be perceived? And if so, how? And by whom? In other words, if to exist is to be perceived, and the existence is contingent on a perceiver, who's perceiving God? And if there's no one or nothing perceiving God, does he exist? Because what Berkeley says is, Esse Est Percipi, to be is to be perceived. So if there's not anything that can perceive God, can we be confident that God exists? And this was sort of an issue for Berkeley. And he attempted to address it in a really complicated way by drawing this distinction between notions and ideas. And I'm not going to get into the weeds on that one because it just gets a little funky. But you can see how Berkeley is doing the same thing that we've seen others do. They take a set of ideas that somebody comes forward with and says, I think, and they say, I think this set of ideas explains what reality is like and how we come to have knowledge of it. And then you see other people picking up those ideas and saying, here's where I think you're right. Here's where I think you're wrong. Here's my idea that I think is better. And it's this almost a recursive process of people going back and revisiting ideas that people have created and trying to advance those ideas further. And everything seems to be going along swimmingly with our folks and their confidence in developing a theory of knowledge that actually aligns with reality. Until our friend David Hume comes on the scene. And for Hume, we've got problems. And that's what we're going to start to look at.